Welcome to the May meeting of the Auxiliary Markings Club, our second Tuesday Zoom meeting. We're really glad you're here, and as I hear said occasionally, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are, whether you're listening in real time or whether you're listening after on our YouTube channel. We're glad you're here. This is usually the point where I do a presentation about the presenter, but since I'm the presenter, I'm not going to do a presentation about myself, except to say that I'm very proud to be the president of the Auxiliary Markings Club. This talk that we're going to have tonight is based on the research that I did for our new anthology on auxiliary markings, which was published jointly with the Philatelic Specialist Society of Canada. And you can access that if you have not already seen it on our website, where it's available as a free download. And we hope that you will you'll have a look at it. I also wanted to say, if you're not a member of the Auxiliary Markings Club, why not? It's the single best deal. We had a couple of people join last night after the RPSC stamp talk on how to collect and what to collect with auxiliary markings, and don't get left behind. The cheapest membership you can have with the greatest benefit, I personally believe, $15 US for a digital membership, and it gives you access to all of the wonderful things that that this group is well known for, most especially a tremendous wealth of knowledge that and people that are always able and happy to help you with your questions. Tonight we're going to talk about the auxiliary markings of Yugoslavia, specifically the labels. I actually thought when I posted this as the topic that most likely we'd have no one or one person who would come, and then they basically would decide, whoops, I'm sorry, I thought this was something else, and leave in the middle of it, because this is not a what one would call a on the cutting edge, forefront North American topic by any extreme. But it's fascinating to me because I collect a lot of Central Europe. I collect pretty much all of Europe. But I started to be really interested in why most of the markings and labels that I found on the mail that I have that's from Yugoslavia didn't really look like the other labels that I had. And so this led me down a rabbit hole to write this article, which we're going to summarize tonight. So I don't know about you, but where I went to school in New York, we didn't spend a lot of time in elementary school talking about the history of Yugoslavia. So let's have a little bit of background. So the concept of Yugoslavia as a common state for all South Slavic peoples emerged as early as the 17th century and really picked up steam in the 19th century. The name, the creation is a combination of two words, Jug, which means south, and you're going to forgive me for my Slavic pronunciations and my Serbo-Croatian pronunciations. I know you're all experts in it, but please be kind. And Slaveni, which means Slavs, so the land of the South Slavs. And it was used in use as early as 1922. Moves toward the formal creation of Yugoslavia accelerated in 1917 with the Corfu Declaration, and of course took place with even greater speed after the end of World War I. So originally, obviously it goes back centuries and centuries, but in the 19th century, this region was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it's down here in this, along the Adriatic Sea, this area here, running down to, well, you can see this the relief map here. Yugoslavia came into existence, as we said, in 1918 after World War I, when most of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was broken up and independence was given to these territories. Most of its northern territories were given to it when the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed. And its territories were reconquered by Serbia from the Ottoman Empire during the Balkan Wars. So it has a long history and a fluid history, which we won't talk a lot about the country after World War I and through about 1926 or so in terms of its history. But if you think about what's happened just in the 20th century with the area that was known as Yugoslavia, from its own country to at the end of World War I to originally a kingdom to renamed as a separate country to occupied by the Germans, taken over by the Warsaw Pact, to the dissolution of that, and now it's fracturing into separate countries within what used to be a bloc. A good friend of mine who's a history professor said, you know, that it was bound to happen that it was going to come unglued, because you just can't take people with that widely diverse a culture, religion, ethnicity, and national identity and force them into a country because it's convenient for the people making the treaty. So for the first 10 years, it was known as the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. Not something that particularly rolls off the tongue, and I think not particularly easy to get on a flag either. So good. This will just give you an idea of the individual territories that were brought together, and of course have now been separated again. King Alexander is responsible for the naming of the country and the let's say branding, not probably the proper historical term, but he's the one that decided that a national identity as a country of known as Yugoslavia, the country of the South Slavs, needed to happen. His father had been also an advocate for this, but had actually been happy with the kingdom of the Slovenes and Croats, etc. So it was King Alexander who renamed the country. So prior to the formation of the country, each of the constituent territories, the 4 territories that we saw on that colored map with the arrows, had their own postal system and history. So Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Slovenia actually issued stamps for the new regime that was coming in November before it was actually formally created. The big problem is, we will see, is that while they each administered their own postal authority, they were supplied by the region that was closest to them, either Hungary or Austria. And so the idea of becoming self-supporting immediately was actually a bit of a challenge. So in the case of the Austrian issued pictorial stamps in 1910, these were overprinted, and you can see these on the right. In Croatia and Slovenia, stamps of Hungary were overprinted with the symbol that you see at the top. And by the time we got to the beginning of January in 1919, Slovenia had actually issued what was its first stamp, the Verigar issue, which can be seen on the right. One of the things that fascinates me about Czechoslovakia and also about Yugoslavia is the weird and not always successful um, balance between um, very modern for the time graphics and images and typography, and very traditional. And I love this image on the right. It's just a it's a common image both in Czech philately and also in Yugoslavian philately. This image of breaking the chains. So the formation of the new kingdom in 1918 explains the reason for its non-use of UPU style return labels until 1926. This is what must have been a spectacular post office in Belgrade, which was sadly torn down and replaced by uh, a giant Soviet style block, which I think, 100 years from now people will be excited about. But this is quite a remarkable building. The decision to adopt the practice may perhaps result from a desire to have the newly formed Yugoslavia, now remember 1926, postal system appear as the modern equivalent of its neighbors in Austria, Hungary, Romania, and Czechoslovakia. Now, please don't misinterpret this. When I say Yugoslav postal labels are remarkably uniform in their appearance throughout their use, what I mean is in the color and in the form of the frame around the words. Beyond that, there is nothing uniform about this at all. All labels through the 1970s are imperforate and bilingual. And with the exception of the insufficient address and the unknown label, all of them use the Roman alphabet. But for reasons that aren't completely clear, those two labels occasionally use the Cyrillic alphabet. And of course, what you see here is a very late 1988, one of the self-stick labels, which is peel and stick. Here's an example of the Cyrillic alphabet on a left with no forwarding address as well. In all cases, the Serbo-Croatian language appears at the top of the label with the French language at the bottom. Remember, French is the UPU international language, and so it has to be on the label. And then it's possible to also, the directives say it's possible to also include a local language as well, but it's not necessary. All labels are bilingual, therefore, with red borders and text that vary in thickness. It's the wide variety of typography and font chosen for these labels that makes them a real rabbit hole to collect. A paper is almost always beige for the earlier issues and white for the later ones. One of the things I find really interesting about this, under the label above, there also is a hand stamp, which indicates that the person to whom this is mailed is unknown. What I find interesting, I mean, obviously this is going from Belgrade, so a large city, to a much smaller town. And it's interesting to me that they have the party is left with no forwarding address label, but don't seem to have the label for unknown, which is the most common of all the labels. And someday I'll get into that. This appears much more common than one would at first think. And it's not as if this is particularly late. Okay, so just a little background on the labels. The UPU mandated the use of these labels. Sorry, I have to get you out of the way here just a second. There we go. Okay. The UPU mandated the use of return labels and hand stamps beginning in 1892. And although the issue of using return labels had come up, even in the 1870s, there was concern expressed about the way returned mail was being handled. And the first time the labels come up is in 1887. Why were they so concerned about it? Apologies for those of you that heard this last night. It cost a reasonable amount of money to send a letter internationally. The last thing you want to know if you spent, however much you spent, is to get a letter back that just says return on it. And so the UPU was very concerned that the labels be used to reflect that every possible manner of delivering a piece of mail had been entertained, and that the actual reason was stated on the envelope, because there was no way to get someone their money back if a piece of mail wasn't delivered, and there was the concern that countries would just not try to deliver the mail in some instances. So these helped to prevent that kind of skullduggery. Some countries like Switzerland, Austria, Germany, and even Belgium chose to use labels from the beginning. And they didn't vary this position until the mid to late 20th century, if at all, most remaining very consistent in their appearance and all. Other countries like England and France began using labels when they were mandated, but quickly switched to hand stamps once they realized that cutting and placing the unperforated labels required what a postal authority friend of mine has said is 5 times the amount of time that striking a cover with a hand stamp required. So they abandoned them almost immediately. The situation in Eastern European countries was not different. While countries such as Bulgaria and Romania began using labels almost immediately, countries such as Albania and Yugoslavia waited much longer to adopt the practice. And remarkably, in the case of Albania, waiting until the 1950s, and in Yugoslavia till the formation of the modern country in 1926. Okay, so what's the issue? I would say at this point in my study of European UPU return labels that Yugoslavia is the least consistent in its production of these labels. So what's the reason? Well, there's a couple things I think that apply. Number one, the regional, cultural, and geographic diversity of the areas that made up the new country had been largely responsible for their own postal administrations prior to unification. So they really ran their own show, in spite of the fact that they were supplied with manuals and with stamps and postal stationery from either Hungary or Austria, depending on where they were located in the area, whatever was close enough. In spite of that, they ran their own show, and I'm not certain that there was a lot of enthusiasm for having everything come under central authority. And they also had their own, in terms of smaller postal items, they also had their own suppliers. The respective postal organizations were overseen, as we have just said, by Austria and Hungary, and printed materials necessary to carry out the work came from them. And this meant that stamps came either from Austria or Hungary and were not printed locally. So this is one of the reasons that I think once we get into late 1919, 1920, the stamps are not an issue. Nobody's ever advocating for independent regions producing their own stamps. The stamps were used as they were I would say in Czechoslovakia as well, as a way of creating a national legend, a national identity. And so nobody had a problem with those. But in terms of the smaller things, I think that they were more of a regional issue. Okay, so the charts below, each section will begin with a little chart. that will give information on the individual's labels printed, and it should say really for the Yugoslavian Postal Authority. The individual labels in each series were not issued together, as we've said, nor was there any general uniformity in the manner in which they were printed. As such, there's a great deal of variety, and the corpus of labels a fact which makes their study very, very confusing. There's no information available on the printing of these labels in the postal archives such as it exists, or the archive in Belgrade. Nothing about these at all. So the assumption, as we said, is that they were printed locally. Okay, much like other countries, these 7 labels were the ones that were deemed the most necessary. There are some other minor labels that deal with receiving payment, or that something had been prepaid, or that an address was not an actual address. But these are the 7 that really are the core of these labels right up into the 1980s. And you can see that the French and the Serbo-Croatian language were the ones that would have appeared on the actual labels. So there was an insufficient address, departed, left no address, incorrectly spelled in English, unknown, deceased, refused, unclaimed, and not at the address. So these are the labels that we're going to be taking a look at. Okay, label 1, address insufficient. So if you look on the left-hand side, because we don't know when they were printed, we have to go with when they appeared on cover to help us date them. And I would like to say that no doubt more labels will come forward, but in a couple of years over the course of time, as people show and sell their collections, but in the couple of years of collecting these intensely, the ones that are shown are the only ones that I've come across. If you scan across here, 1931 is the earliest cover that I've seen for this, and they go into the 60s. I've never seen one after 1966. If you look down, the alphabet is all Roman on these, and the font is S for serif or SS for sans serif. And where it's divided, it's to show where the color is divided, as in 1956. It's to show that the 2 languages used a different font. And then in terms of capitalization, and last of all, one of the things that is actually really helpful is the existence of a period at the end of the word, or not a period. Very often those make it much easier, as you would expect, to be able to identify these. So a couple of these have come from the excellent series of articles that Tony Warwick-Cavish did with a partner whose name now escapes me. I'm sorry, I can't remember it. They both are deceased now. But that appeared in auxiliary markings, that actually was one of the things that got me interested in these labels to begin with. And this first one from 1931 is interesting for a couple of reasons. Most importantly, the existence of the period at the end of the first line, and no period at the end of the second line. This label is virtually impossible to find on cover. I've seen one, and it was on a very, very expensive piece of postal history that had a lot going for it, not the label. And so that's not something I was able to pick up. This is a label that I discovered myself, and I apologize for the fact that this is not terribly, you can't see it terribly well. It was previously unrecorded, and it may have been used as late as 1960, between 1956 and 1960. There's a label from 1960. Again, notice that the in this case, please forgive my cat Zippy the Wonder Cat, who has who is very vocal. He's part Oriental short hair, and he may think I'm talking to him and come up and be part of this. So we'll try to move him on. This one is interesting because you can see that the frame itself is broken. And this is the only label on which this happens. And it's consistent across all of the places. And you can tell if you look from side to side that the brakes are pretty consistent in terms of their positioning. And then last of all, this is also extremely difficult to find on cover, a 1966 label. The left with no forwarding address is, there are a few more of those. We have 6 in this particular instance. I was very surprised when I started searching for these that there were a number of them that had not been recorded. You can see that 1929 to 52 first column, first row, and then 1952 and 1957. What I find interesting about this is that first row of it was in use for 23 years. Again, and most of the information that I can find says that most of the use of that during that period comes from the area in or close to Bosnia. So it may have been locally produced there in great number so that it was used specifically, but it can be found in other places as well. 1952 and 57, the Cyrillic alphabet makes an appearance on these 2 labels, and one wonders whether this is a result of the Soviet intervention in Yugoslavia, possibly. Again, not really possible to say. And then the last one that we're going to see is the new earliest known use. Remember that the earliest labels we have are dated on covers that come from 1926. So this first one, which is from 1926, was previously unknown in that year and thought to have been produced from 29 to 52, but it was actually 26 to 52. 1929. Again, if you just look at the difference between the font, it's so interesting. I mean, both of these sets, both lines have periods. The font on the bottom on the French language is reasonably similar, but the other is completely different. Here's the Cyrillic one from 1952. Again, the parti is section at the bottom is reasonably consistent throughout this, but the Serbo-Croatian changes. And then this, we end up with, this particular one doesn't have the Cyrillic on it, but the Cyrillic is also can be found in 1957. And this one, 1958, is one of the really late printings that appears on this kind of ivory paper. This cover's in pretty good shape, so it's not that the paper of the label is dirty. It's just a strange ivory paper. Okay, and the earliest known use of this 1966 label, very thought to have been produced in at the end of the year to go into 67, but found here in October. Okay, next up are the unknown labels. Now, in all of these UPU labels, the two that are most common are unknown in Kanu, and the return label. Some countries have a retour label because obviously that would accompany any piece that was being sent back. Again, very interesting. The 1926 label, the earliest label that we've seen in this series, and you'll see that in a minute. It has Cyrillic on it, which is very unusual to think of, especially when the desire of the king was to make sure that Yugoslavia was seen as part of the European, the new Europe post World War I. This particular one, as it says on the right, is the earliest UPU return label in the series. It's an example of a label which uses the Cyrillic alphabet rather than the Roman. Both languages have the first letter capitalized, with the Yugoslav language, the Serbo-Croatian, printed in sans serif, and in French in serif, and there's no punctuation. 1956, an interesting thing to look for. There are two distinct reds used for this particular label. It is the darker of the two shades. If you find the kind of blood red, that is the rarer of the two of them, which, unlike Doug's experience with the barcodes, means that you probably pay $1.50 for it instead of $1. 1988, we'll see an example of the first self-stick label that was produced. So here's this earliest of all the labels I've ever seen, 1926, again with the Cyrillic alphabet on it. 28 to 1950, again the same thing. It's interesting to me that that once they had the ability to perforate, these were not perforated. And this is one of the reasons that, I mean, right up until the point that they were literally peel and stick. And I think it's another verification of the fact that these were not produced at the state printing works, because had they been, they would have been perforated for sure, and they're not. As we said on the first slide that you saw, here is another example of this Nepoznat and Inkanu hand stamp, although in this particular case, it's on the same piece with the actual label. 1934, here is also the Cyrillic label. Sorry, that got covered up when I put the date on it, but you can see that. Same thing in 1940. Again, interestingly, hand stamped on the right as well, and the label included also. 1956, this is the darker red. 58. 1977, notice the white paper. And again, you know, just from cover to cover, label to label, they're all different. And then here's the first peel and stick. Interestingly, I have not seen a lot of these on this ivory color peel and stick paper. And I wonder if this is a chemical reaction to the peel and stick glue. Because I've not seen this kind of yellowish ivory in this, and I've never seen a sheet of it. There are quite a few sheets of these that are available and reasonably well intact, so I'm wondering if this is just a chemical reaction. Okay, the fourth label is the deceased label, and we've got a couple of really interesting things to look at with this particular one. Again, it's a reasonably late label, not till 1935. Did this make an appearance? As far as we know, I've never seen an earlier one. And it was previously unknown until I started writing this article and realized I had it. Nothing particularly unique about the 38 or 45. When we get to 1965, you'll notice that the word umro, which is the Serbo-Croatian for deceased, is spelled UMRL, which is the Slovenian spelling of that word. And so these, no doubt, this particular label would have been used, I would assume, in Slovenia. There are a couple of other labels in this series of labels that also make use of a Slovenian spelling of certain words. I've never seen them. I've been able to acquire them. But in this particular case, it just adds credence, I think, to the fact, again, that these were printed regionally. So here's the previously unknown DCD Umro label. What's interesting about this one is that the lines of the frame don't connect. That's not very common in this series of labels. And this one is a discovery copy of the earliest or previously unknown label. This is more like, if you have a look at this one here, occasionally there'll be a slight separation in one of the corners where things have worn down a little bit, but nothing like this one, which is interesting. So again, it comes down to, is this label worn? Is the plate from which this was made worn? Or is it just how it was produced? It'll be interesting to see as more of those labels come forward. Yeah, sorry that this is underneath. This is a label that was produced at the end of World War II, and paper was in very short supply. And so the label itself was produced in very small quantity. And as such, it's very difficult to find on cover. The Germans don't seem to have been the least bit interested in these return labels. And so there's very little difference during the German occupation. But this is one of the only labels that I know that has this very heavy font on it. And it seems the Italians also did this on their 24B labels following World War I, or World War II, sorry, this kind of heavy print. And I don't know if it was a reaction to the past or what it is, but it's definitely an outlier in terms of its style. And here's the Slovenian spelling. As we said, I'm sorry that wasn't like that when I looked at it. But anyway, as we said, the Slovenian here, the spelling of M-U-R-L is the Slovenian spelling, 1965. And as we know, there were movements even at this point, to separate the conglomerate countries into individual countries. And so maybe, who knows, could be a political statement, I don't know. Label 5 is the refused label. These are probably the least remarkable of all of the labels, although I'm sure you'll agree that all of these have been quite remarkable. The only outlier here is a 1950 label, which we'll see that was previously unknown. I'm actually very fond of this label from 1928. I'm not really sure why I think it's so beautiful, but something from a symmetrical sense that I find very satisfying about this one. 1934, again, this comes from Tony Worokevich's excellent article on these. It's virtually impossible to find this particular cover or this particular label on cover. Same thing with this one. Seems to be the labels that were produced in short number in the 30s, in the mid 30s, that are the ones that are particularly difficult to find. I know we've seen one or two from the 60s, late 50s and 60s that also were, but these seem to be the ones that were not used quite as dramatically as some of the other ones. 1941, again, a heavier font, an unusual font, not quite as dramatic as that Umro font that we saw, but again, completely different. And the square period is also kind of a defining characteristic of this particular label. 1950, this was an previously unrecorded label. Again, what's really interesting when you get into these later printings, and you see this all over Europe, in countries like Belgium where there are multiple languages, it was a real political statement as to which language had dominance on the label. The Belgians solved this after World War II by simply creating labels with the words side by side, but turning them upside down, so that this one would be right side up, this one would be upside down, and depending on what part of the country you were in, you could just invert it. But I wonder in this particular case if this is a statement as well, as the Serbo-Croatian gets larger and larger. 1956. Okay, unclaimed mail, label number 6. Again, there's nothing in this particular set that's particularly dramatic except for the differences in them. The 1928 label was previously unknown, and the earliest one anybody had seen prior to this was 1936. So an interesting addition. I love the delicateness of the typeface chosen for this particular one. The printing date on this, someone that I know who has done some work on these is reasonably sure that he's seen a copy of this label, having been reminded when he saw mine, that he at one time saw a copy of this label on a piece of mail from 1926. Only a stamp collector would know these things, right? And if that's the case, then the printing date on this might actually be as early as 1926. Interesting, the delicacy of this particular choice of typeface for this set of labels. Even in this case, it's just so beautiful. Even the capitals in this case, capitalization. We get slightly more pedestrian during the Soviet bloc days, Warsaw Pact days. 57 to 65. And then again, an example of a peel and stick, rather unstylish. Very interesting to me that the lower line, the French line of text, on all of these labels, there's that slight indentation in the frame, which says to me that the actual text got a bit too close for comfort. And I obviously will never, well, don't say never. Chances are we'll never see the original plates for these, but it would be interesting to see if they were cut down slightly to make sure there was no confusion on what that letter was. And then last of all, and only 2 labels in this case, the address doesn't exist label. Interesting in this particular instance that no labels exist for this on mail before 1946. I also have not found a tremendous amount of hand stamps that have this message on. There are a few, but I haven't seen a lot of them that go way back much before this, maybe 5 years to the early 40s. So it's possible that this was a later addition in terms of the actual list of things that were included on label names. This again comes from Tony and his compatriots' fine article. Again, this particular one was produced at the end of World War One or World War II, and paper was in very short supply, and so it's difficult to find this on cover. My sense is that Yugoslavia is obviously would have been a larger country than Czechoslovakia, and would have received more mail than a country like Czechoslovakia or some of the really hard ones to find labels for. It's very interesting to think that Bulgaria started using labels almost immediately, but they're virtually impossible to find. And in most cases, it's no doubt because there was such a small volume of mail, and what mail there was not preserved. But at any event, this is a very hard label to find, printed on very poor quality paper, without a doubt, because there were other things to be worried about in Central Europe at this particular time. And then by 1948, things had improved. Again, I have a strange feeling that this label may have been in service as early as the late 1946, early 47, because this particular one shows some damage to the frame. And you can argue, okay, well, those two little corner blocks are in the same place, and the left and upper left and lower right corner is also would be consistent because they're opposite. But it seems a strange adornment to that line, I think, and I'm wondering if there's some damage to the frame on this. So it may be older than 1948. So before we get into, and I'm sure there's just going to be tons of questions based on this, please don't feel bad if there aren't. This is a reasonably new study. It has been undertaken by a couple of philatelists in the 1980s and 90s, but nobody's really done a real study of the original 7 in this particular set, trying to find the chronological order and print dates. So no doubt more of these are going to come to light. If you happen to have any in your collection, I'd love to see them. But they are without a doubt one of the hardest sets of labels to collect, because we can't date them with sureness. We can't tell where they were printed, and we have no record of how many of them were printed or who did the printing. The only thing we know is that they clearly were not produced in the central printing house. So anyway, that ends our presentation for tonight. Let me just quickly, before I close this out, remind you that if you enjoyed this, I know you're going to enjoy Doug Quine's excellent presentation on hiding in plain sight, letter mail, barcodes, misdirected mail, and the modern postal history, which will take place on the second Tuesday of June. And if you do download our anthology from the website, make sure to read Doug's article in advance, because you'll learn a ton. So I'll stop the sharing there, and Thank you all very much for your attention. Any questions? Doug.
Greg, this is Frederick.
Hi,
I,
Frederick.
I have a question about one of the early covers that you showed
Yeah.
that has the parti label and then has the in Kanu hand stamp.
Yep.
You said that was to a small town, I believe. The postmark is Belgrade,
Right.
and it says Belgrade at the very bottom of the cover, the handwritten address. And I was wondering, how did you recognize that as being a small town?
Hang on.
Is there more to the handwritten address that tells you that?
The the only thing that I can say, I looked up and I can't tell you now. I looked up the town that's it's addressed to, and it's a small town somewhere in Serbia. Um, do you think that that says Belgrade at the bottom?
It looked to me like now my Cyrillic the reading of Cyrillic
Yeah.
script goes back many years when I took Russian in college. We won't say exactly when that was, but it sure looks like Belgrade to me.
Okay. I know how to get in touch with you. Let me have a look and I will see what I can dig up about it. But I think when I looked that up, it was not the case. And Zippy the Wonder Cat agrees as well. So I may have to go back and look at that. So thanks for pointing that out.
Greg, a question along the same line, if you don't mind,
Sure.
along the same cover. You had mentioned you have that one and perhaps a couple others that have the same marking on the envelope as well as the label. Would
Yeah.
those have been applied at the same time or different times, or what are your thoughts in that regards?
The big question for me is why you would put the same hand stamp and the same label on a cover. So I'm almost wondering if this is in Belgium, every time you send a piece of mail out with a different postman, they have to record their postal number on the back. And every time it comes back, each postman stamps or makes a manuscript marking to say that they have tried and that this is not deliverable or the address is not correct or whatever. I can't see any reason to double the thing. So I'm wondering if this was stamped when it was brought back and then it was a multiple attempt to deliver it. That's the only answer that I have, you know? I'm going to be on the lookout now, having identified 4 or 5 covers like that. I'm going to be on the lookout for more that have that hand stamp and see if we can figure it out. It's a good question, though, Tom.
Hand stamp is bilingual, is that right?
Sorry, what is?
The hand stamp.
Yes. It's
Okay,
exactly the same wording as the label.
okay. So it's not a matter of trying to comply with UPU.
No, no, no.
But I did have a separate question.
Sure.
You commented on the two colors and the blood red labels being the unusual one,
Yep.
but there was a color that really just jumped out at me. It felt like an almost fluorescent red that appeared on two or three of the covers, where it almost felt like there was a light behind it. It was so bright. And I'm wondering, maybe it was simply that the cover was dark and therefore the scanner exaggerated the red, but
I wonder. Do you remember which ones they were?
the first one was a large one at the top of the cover, but on sort of a grayish cover there was one. But just flipping through, it seems to me that usually the red is sort of a dull red
Yeah,
as opposed to a screaming in your face red.
yeah. Let's see if we can find it.
Just start flipping through them quickly.
Yeah, yeah. Ah, there we go. Okay. 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 Yeah, yeah.
further in. So these are sort of a dull, yeah,
Yeah,
keep going. That again, sort of a dull red.
yeah,
Yeah, that one. Go back one. The big one that's upside down.
yeah,
That one. That feels almost fluorescent compared to the few
yeah.
before it that are sort of a dull red.
My gut tells me that that's got something to do with the scan, you know,
Okay.
the color wise.
Because this
I,
is even on a bright cover. I mean, it's on a white cover. So it's
yeah,
not that the scanner's trying to put extra light in to illuminate the cover,
but it's not
but
a, it is a dark, I mean, yeah, it's on a white cover, but it is a kind of like tawdry, it's been around. That cover's pretty dirty, so it may have tried to compensate.
hmm. Yeah, this one just feels almost like a red lipstick or something.
Yeah,
Um, and I think if you go back one, yeah, this one, very flat, sort of dull.
yeah,
Almost feels like it's matte instead of gloss, maybe. I don't know, but the other one felt almost fluorescent.
yeah. It makes perfect sense that the ink also wouldn't have been consistent. I mean, there clearly was no communication on right, what was the right um, style of label and typeface and font and all of those things. So I'm thinking to myself, maybe, it was just that was the red we happened to have lying around that day, so let's use it for the labels, you know?
Hmm.
Yeah,
Well, I was thinking if you put it later on, if you put the presentation in slide sorter mode,
yep,
my prediction is you'll look at it and there are going to be three or four of them that are that striking color of red,
okay,
um, compared to the others that are sort of a flatter red,
yeah, I'll
you
take a
know,
look at it.
more
Take a look.
magenta kind of red.
Yeah, yeah, I'll take a look at it for sure.
Have you ever
Ma-
found labels in pairs or
Um,
multiples?
there are a few, but I don't have a lot of them. I don't have a lot of them. Yeah, I can't explain why that is. I don't know because there are, you know, I mean, they were very cautious to not get too rambunctious with these return labels and be specific with them. But I don't know that I have more than two or three covers that have multiples on it.
And the multiples are the same label or
No,
they're,
different
because I think you
labels.
mentioned they used to print multiple labels on a sheet, different.
No, they were all the same labels on one sheet. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Each sheet had the same label.
Hmm. Greg, you'd mentioned earlier about the scarcity of paper, and in light of that, was it a UPU requirement throughout some of those scarce paper periods for labels to be used, or was there some other reason why they didn't use hand stamps almost exclusively?
The the only thing, I mean, I can't answer. I don't know. The only thing I can say is the Yugoslavia very, unlike the French who use hand stamps for everything.
Yeah.
The Yugoslavians and the Czechs and that Central European kind of core, they were much more enthusiastic about labels. And so I don't know. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, I'm sure that the things that were required to make hand stamps would also have been in short supply at that point. Maybe it was easier to print them. I don't know, but I do know that a lot of the countries that were either occupied or were on quote the other side of the ally um, division, a lot of those countries have really poor labels um, after the war is over, and in all cases, it's almost because the paper is terrible. There's a wonderful Italian label from 1946. Their labels are totally different than these. They're the only country that does their own thing. But these Italian labels are just crazy because they're on the most ridiculous paper, but it's so clear that they were printed by either by the Army, U.S. Army printing office, or that they were printed in a way that they were trying to impress their occupiers with how current and up to date they could be, because there's nothing else like them.
Hmm.
So I don't know. I mean, who knows? But it's an interesting question. I'll look into it.
Okay, thanks.
Well, you've been very brave tonight. Thank you for your attention and for, staying awake, which was great. I think one of the great things about having a presentation with label numbers on it is, like graduate students, you can tell, okay, we're on label number 6, we're almost done, which always causes your class to perk up, But thank you very much for your attention and for coming tonight to hear about this. And if you have anything and you'd like to send it along, please do, because I think we're just scratching the surface of this. It'll be interesting to see what we find. All right, well, thank you, everybody, and have a good night, and thank you for coming, and please join us on June the 10th for Doug's excellent exploration of barcodes hiding in plain sight, okay? All right, take
Thanks,
care.
Greg.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great research.
Thank you.